Sorry about that. Yeah. My camera cuts off at 10 minutes whether I like it or not, so I'm just gonna continue on with, chapter 1. The last line was, here we go. Evenings like this usually ended badly. Ford would get out of his skull on whiskey, huddle in a corner with some girl, and explain to her in slurred phrases that honestly the color of flying saucers didn't really much matter. Thereafter, staggering semi-paralytic down the night streets, he would often ask passing policemen if they knew the way to Beetlejuice. The policeman would always say something like, "Don't you know it's about time you went off, sir?" "I'm trying to, baby, I'm trying to," is what Ford invariably replied on these occasions. In fact, what he was really looking for when he stared distractedly in the sky was any kind of flying saucer at all. The reason he said green was the fact that green was the traditional space livery of the Beetlejuice Trading Scouts. Ford was desperate that flying saucer all would arrive soon, because 15 years is a long time to get stranded anywhere, particularly somewhere as mind-boggling dull as Earth. Ford wished that a flying saucer arrived soon, because he knew how to flag flying saucers down and get less from them. He knew how to see the marvels on the universe for less than 30 Altarian dollars a day. In fact, Ford Prefect was a roving researcher for the wholly remarkable book, The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. Human beings are great adapters, and by lunchtime life in the environs of Arthur's house had settled into a steady routine. It was Arthur's accepted role to lie squelching in the mud, making occasional demands to see his lawyer, his mother, or a good book. It was Mr. Prosser's accepted role to tackle Arthur with occasional new ploys, such as the For the Public Good talk, or the March of Progress talk, the "They knocked my house down once, you know, never looked back" talk, and various other cajoleries and threats. It was the bulldozer driver accepted role to sit about drinking coffee and experimenting with union regulations to see how they could turn the situation to their financial advantage. The earth moved slowly in its diurnal course. The sun was beginning to dry out the mud that Arthur lay in. A shadow moved across them again. "Hello, Arthur," said the shadow. Arthur looked up, squinting into the sun, and was startled to see Ford Prefect standing above him. "Ford, hello! How are you?" "Fine," said Ford. "Look, are you busy?" "Am I busy?" exclaimed Arthur. "Well, I've got all these bulldozers and things to lie in front of because they'll knock my house down if I don't. But other than that, well, no, not especially. Why?" They don't have sarcasm on Beetlejuice, and Ford often failed to notice it unless he was really concentrating. He said, "Good. Is there any way we can talk?" "What?" said Arthur then. For a few seconds, Ford seemed to ignore him and stared fixedly into the sky like a rabbit trying to get run over by a car. Then, suddenly, he squatted down beside Arthur. "We've got to talk," he said urgently. "Fine," said Arthur. "Talk and drink. It's vitally important that we talk and drink. Now, we'll go into the pub in the village." He looked in the sky, nervous, expectant. "Look, don't you understand?" shouted Arthur. He pointed to Prosser. "That man wants to knock my house down." Ford glanced at him, puzzled. "Well, you can't do it while you're away, can't he?" "But I don't want him to." "Ah. Look, what's the matter with you, Ford?" said Arthur. Nothing's the matter. Listen to me. Look, I've got to tell you the most important thing you've ever heard. I've got to tell you now, and I've got to tell you in the saloon bar of the House and Groom." "But why?" "Because you're going to need a very stiff drink." Ford stared at Arthur, and Arthur was astonished to find that his will was beginning to weaken. He didn't realize this was of an old drinking game that Ford learned to play in the hyperspace ports that served the Madronite mining belts and the star systems of Orion Beta. The game was not unlike the Earth game called Indian Wrestling. And it was played like this. Two contestants would sit at either side of a table with a glass in front of them. Between them would be placed a bottle of jank spirit, as immortalized in that ancient Orion mining song. "Oh, don't give me none more of that old jank spirit. No, you don't give me none of that more old jank spirit. For my head will fly, my tongue will lie, my eyes will fry, and I may die. Won't you pour me one more of that old sinful jank spirit?" Each of the two contestants would then concentrate their will on the bottle and attempt to tip it and pour spirit into the glass of his opponent, who would then have to drink it. The bottle then would be refilled. The game would be played again, and again, and again. But once you started to lose, you'd keep on losing, because one of the effects of jank spirit is to depress telepathic power. As soon as the predetermined quantity had been consumed, the final loser would have to perform forfeit, which is usually obscenely biological. Ford Prefect often played to lose. Ford stared at Arthur, who began to think perhaps he didn't want to go to the Horse and Groom after all. But what about my house?" he asked plaintively. Ford looked across at Mr. Prosser, and suddenly a wicked thought struck him. "He wants to knock your house down?" "Yes, he wants to build a—" "Oh, and he can't because you're lying in front of the bulldozer?" "Yes, and I'm sure we can come to some agreement," said Ford. "Excuse me," he shouted. Mr. Prosser, who was arguing with the spokesman for the bulldozer drivers about whether or not Arthur Dent constituted a mental health hazard and how much they should get paid if he did, looked around. He was surprised and slightly alarmed to see the Arthur Head company. "Yes? Hello?" he called. "Has Mr. Dent come to his senses yet? Can we for a moment," called Ford, "assume he hasn't?" "Well," said Mr. Prosser, "and can we also assume that he's not going to be staying here all day?" "So? So all your men are going to be standing around all day doing nothing?" Could be, could be. Well, if you're resigned to doing that anyway, you actually don't really need him to lie here all the time, do you? What? Well, you don't," said Ford patiently, "actually need him here." Mr. Prosser thought about this. "Well, not as such," he said. "Not exactly need." Prosser was worried. He thought that one of them wasn't making a lot of sense. Ford said, "So if you would like him to take it as read that he's actually here, then he and I could slip off down to the pub for half an hour. How does that sound?" Mr. Prosser thought it sounded perfectly potty. "That sounds perfectly reasonable," he said in a reassuring tone of voice, wondering who he was trying to reassure. "And if you want to pop off for a quick one yourself later on," said Ford, "we can always cover for you in return." "Thank you very much," said Mr. Prosser, who no longer knew how to play this. "Thank you very much. Yes, that's very kind." He frowned, and then smiled, and then tried to do both at once. Failed, grasped hold of his fur hat and rolled it fistfully around the top of his head. He could only assume that he had just won. "So," continued Ford Prefect, "if you would like to come over here and just lie down—" "What? Oh, I'm sorry," said Ford. "Perhaps I hadn't made myself perfectly clear. Someone's got to lie in front of the bulldozer, haven't they? Or there won't be anything stopping them from driving into Mr. Dent's house, will there?" "What?" said Mr. Prosser again. "It's very simple," said Ford. "My client, Mr. Dent, says that he will stop lying here in the mud on the sole condition that you come over and take over from him." "What are you talking about?" said Mr. Prosser. And then Ford was sitting there, and Arthur said, "What are you talking about, Ford?" But Ford nudged him with his shoe to be quiet. "You want me," said Prosser, spelling out this new thought to himself, "to come lie there?" "Yes." "In front of the bulldozer?" "Yes." "Instead of Mr. Dent?" "Yes." "In the mud?" "In, as you say, the mud." As Mr. Prosser realized that he was substantially the loser after all, it was as a weight was lifted off his shoulders. This was more like the world he knew. He sighed. "In return for which you will take Mr. Dent with you down to the pub." "That's it," said Ford. "Exactly." Mr. Prosser took a few nervous steps forward and stopped. "Promise?" he said. "Promise," said Ford. He turned to Arthur. "Come on," he said to him. "Get up and let the man lie down." Arthur stood up, feeling as if he was in a dream. Ford beckoned to Prosser, who sadly, awkwardly, sat down in the mud. He left that whole life with some sort of dream, and sometimes he wondered whose it was, and whether or not they were enjoying it. The mud folded itself around his bottom and his arms and oozed into his shoes. Ford looked at him severely. "And no sneaking around Mr. Dent's house and knocking it down while he's away, all right?" "The mere thought," growled Mr. Prosser, "hadn't even begun to speculate," he continued, settling back, "about the merest possibility of crossing my mind." He saw the bulldozer driver's union representative approaching, and let his head sink back and close his eyes. He was trying to marshal his arguments for proving that he did not now constitute a mental health hazard himself. He was far from certain about this. His mind seemed to be full of noises, horses, smoke, and the stench of blood. This always happened when he felt miserable and put upon, and he had never been able to explain it to himself. In a high dimension of which we know nothing, the almighty Khan bellowed with rage, but Mr. Prosser only trembled slightly and whimpered. He began to feel little pricks of water behind his eyelids. Bureaucratic cock-ups, angry men lying in mud, indecipherable strangers handing out inexplicable humiliation, and an unidentified army of horsemen laughing at him in his head. What a day. What a day! Ford Prefect knew that it didn't matter that a pair of dingoes' kidneys whether Arthur's house got knocked down or not now. Arthur remained very worried. "But can we trust him?" he said. "Myself, I would trust him till the end of the earth," said Ford. "Oh, yes," said Arthur. "And how far is that?" "About 12 minutes away," said Ford. "Come on, I need a drink." Alright, well, that was all of Chapter 1. That was a long-ass video. That's like 18 fucking minutes of Chapter 1. I don't know how the hell we're gonna make it through this entire goddamn book, but stay tuned, it's gonna rule.